welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and good to see all of you up there again. And Janine, thank you for all your support and encouragement. It's always a joy to have a little exchange of ideas with you. It's delightful. Well, thank you for having me.
Well, we are thrilled to. Now, we're wondering if you might give us just a few opening comments about the Constitutional Convention as we get started in this 11-week series to walk through the U.S. Constitution.
You just introduced,
and I'll just pop in. I'll just pop in and say, Professor Gordon Lloyd, you're my hero. I think you're the greatest.
You're my heroine.
Oh, good. I just treasured you and think you're brilliant. I didn't respond when you said that because I thought you were launching into a description, but
I thought I was
so
too.
much for okay. Well, anyway, thrilled you're with us. You hang the moon as far as I'm concerned.
Likewise.
Well,
Yeah.
would you like to just give us 10 to 12
sure.
minutes of opening comments on the Constitution?
About the convention? Yeah. Well, one piece of advice is if you think of the 88 days at the convention when they met, they didn't, and what they landed up was 7 articles. At Article 1, legislature; Article 2, the executive; Article 3, the judiciary; Article 4, what the interstate relations; Article 5, how do we amend the Constitution; Article 6, who's boss; and Article 7, how do we get this thing from a plan to a constitution. If you think through the 88 days, they start right at the beginning and work their way through. You're going to be surprised and probably disappointed. Because what they start off with, Article 1 through 7 is what they end up with. Where do they start? They start with the Articles of Confederation. And if we go back to 1776, and I'm so glad that you announced the Ashbrook site because it has 4 parts to it, which I think is the 4-part American story. Declaration, the Constitutional Convention, Brutus, Publius ratifying convention, Bill of Rights. So that's what that whole story is doing. So what we're looking at today is one slice of that story, but you can't really look at that slice without looking at the whole. So the story really begins in 1776, and it's not only independence from Britain, it is independence from the whole idea of being a colony and moving toward a state. So between 1776 and 1780, you get a very vigorous and extensive state constitutional development. Declaring independence is also sort of declaring interdependence with each other. And that becomes more difficult. And that doesn't pass. That kind of intercontinental agreement between 13 now states separated from Britain, that doesn't come until 1781. So looking from 1787 backwards, you're looking at, through the 1780s, strong, decentralized state governments with a certain understanding of what it means to be a Republican form of government. Weak executive, strong legislature, frequent elections, Bill of Rights, and a very weak and late coming Articles of Confederation, which is structured on the states. Not one person, one vote, it's one state, one vote, regardless of population. And powers only, under the Articles, they can only exercise those powers which are expressly granted. And 2 powers were not expressly granted. One was the power to regulate interstate commerce, and 2 was the power to tax for the common defense and general welfare. And so by the time we get to 1787, why did Madison and the others meet? They met because they thought the state legislatures were too strong relative to the Articles of Confederation. And they thought the Articles of Confederation were too weak relative to the strengths of the states. So the reason that they're there is really, there are those like Washington and Madison who wanted a structural change. They wanted to change the Articles of Confederation in such a way that you really can create a government, albeit limited. And then you have the powers people who are particularly interested in increasing the power to regulate interstate commerce and tax, but I'm not particularly interested in changing the structure. 88 days, very early on, Madison and Randolph from Virginia introduced the Virginia Plan, which alters the structure of the Articles of Confederation so that it becomes based on people, so that Massachusetts and Virginia and Pennsylvania are going to get more representation than Georgia, South Carolina, and New Hampshire. So they're going to try to create, and furthermore, the Virginia Plan gives to the general government, this new creation, all those powers for which the states are incompetent. And that's a wonderful word. You're incompetent to do that. But who decides? The new government. And that's very early on. And that meets, and so Madison has to defend it on June the 6th. And he defends it by saying, through the system of representation, we're going to be able to extend what is known as republicanism, because republicanism through history has only lasted, if it's lasted for very long, in small Venice, the very, very small countries. And Roger Sherman on that day from Connecticut says, people are happier in small constituencies than they are in large constituencies. And that sort of sets the tone for what I would call Act 1 of the Constitutional Convention. I put it in the book at the end. You can see there's a guide. I put that as a 4-act drama. So Act 1 is testing the existence of the Articles and state governments in their capacity. And the Virginia Plan does exactly that. Resistance set in from Sherman, who was very happy with the structure, was willing to bend with powers. On June the 11th, Sherman comes up with a brilliant idea, and that is, why don't we compromise? And the compromise is, why don't we have one house based on the people, and another one called the Senate based on the states. So we have representation of the people and representation of the states. How about that? The Articles just represented states and no people. Virginia Plan represents people, no states. How about that as a compromise? And the South Carolina delegation says, whoa, wait a minute. We're talking people and states. How about wealth? In history, wealth has always been somehow represented, because without money, you can't do anything. And the wealth the South Carolina delegation had in mind, in particular, was slavery. So June the 11th is a pivotal day, but that's the day that these 3 component parts come together. And for the next, and what happens is that Sherman's proposal, a compromise proposal, is rejected. And so you get the New Jersey Plan, which is introduced. And the New Jersey Plan goes straight back to the structure of the Articles, as if we're starting all over again and adding some powers. And they stick with this all through Act 1. And it's very difficult, not just because it's a long book, as quite rightly been said, but deliberation isn't the same as action. Sometimes you have to sleep on it. Sometimes you come back, and negotiations, you start where you did 2 days before. And they go on like this until the end of June. And it's very interesting. The end of June, they decide to create a committee. And this is how things get done. If you can't do it, you create a committee. So they create a committee. And interestingly, Madison doesn't get on that committee. So you know already there's a certain shift towards Sherman. Sherman and Ellsworth from Connecticut are on there. And what did they come out with? The Connecticut Compromise. And that's, and for me, fascinating, the last entry for July the 1st, no, it's July the 1st and July the 2nd, last entry in Madison's commentary is, in order to give the committee time to work, and for those who wish to observe Independence Day, July the 4th, we hereby adjourn. And people have told me Independence Day only became important in American law because Jefferson and Franklin and Adams died on July the 4th, 50 years into. But here we have it in a Constitutional Convention. Other than Sundays, which they take off, they took July the 4th off, which means that Independence Day, July the 4th, was important right from the start. I could go further than that. Jerry Committee comes up with a proposal, which is exactly the same thing as, you might as well call it the Sherman Committee. There's a person who's been overlooked, not appreciated in terms of how he helped create the Constitution. And so they came up with this proposal, and Madison didn't like it because it didn't get rid of one of the defects, or what he calls vices. So Act 2 begins, and you think that during this time, Madison is winning, but he doesn't. He's not winning. And so now we get to the Jerry Committee and the creation of Act 3, which is, all right, now that the Sherman-Jerry Committee has created this. By the way, Jerry is important because he comes from Massachusetts, which is a large state, and the expectation he's going to vote in favor of one person, one vote, but he votes for the compromise. And Massachusetts is divided, which is extremely important for the passage of the Connecticut Compromise. Too much detail. Act 3, there's only 4 acts. Act 3. Well, how do we pull this all together in terms of a draft? What we've done, what we've gone through. And so a committee of detail is created. And the role of the committee in detail, right at the end of July, beginning of August, their job is to pull together a draft of the Constitution based on everything that has gone before. And there's 5 people on this committee. And it has to be 1 from Massachusetts, 1 from Virginia, and it's not Madison, it's Randolph, 1 from Pennsylvania, and it is, the 1 from Massachusetts is Gorham, who's the Speaker of the House, and 1 from Pennsylvania, which is James Wilson, and 1 left over. You always have to have 5. This is a tradition which began with the Declaration of Independence, having a committee on 5. So you got these 3 big states represented. You got Connecticut represented because it has to be there because it's the Connecticut Compromise. So Sherman Ellsworth is on it, and you have 1 left over. What's left over? Get it to South Carolina. So what comes out of the committee in detail is the first draft structure of what we would call the Constitution of the United States. But in there is 1 clause which really causes the delegates trouble through the month of August as they go through it. And it is the clause which says Congress will never control the slave trade forever, not at all, forever. And that is the work of Rutledge from South Carolina. And Madison is furious when it comes out to the floor. Presumption is whatever the committee does is going to have a preferential treatment. But this 1 clause causes such consternation that Madison manages to get a new committee created just to look at that 1 clause with commerce at its side. And so Madison is willing to compromise. He says, all right, let's move from never to 1800. And that's how the recommendation comes out of the committee. Another South Carolina delegate says, what about 1808? And that's agreed upon. Why 1808? Well, it's a generation. Father in, grandfather in the current generation. Madison wanted it to be a new birth of freedom and a new century, 1800. And he was furious. We move now into Act 4. And Act 4 is made up of really 2 to 3 parts. One is a committee called the Brewery Committee, or less wonderfully called the Leftovers Committee. That is, whatever is left over to be done. And what is the major thing to be left over? How do you elect the president? And it's not that they haven't dealt with it. It's that Well, I can't answer the question whether she'll be one president or two unless I know how long they're going to serve. I can't answer that question unless I know whether they can be impeached. I can't answer that question unless I know whether they can be reelected, and I can't answer that unless I know how the electing is going to take place. And I can't answer that unless I know whether there's one or two presidents. And so that's gone on around and around and around. And the work of the Braley Committee is to create the Electoral College. And the Electoral College is based on the Connecticut Compromise. It is going to be a combination of people and states. That's one. Two is the creation of the Committee on Style. And the Committee on Style is pulling everything together from Committee on Detail, all the talks that have been had, Committee on Style, and there are going to be 5 people on there. And anyway, one from Massachusetts, what, et cetera, et cetera. You got the, but one left over. The South Carolina thing has been settled. So who gets it? New York. Who's there? Hamilton. He wasn't there for half the time. He left until he got serious in his mind. So now you got these 5 people. Madison's on it. So the Committee on Style with Gouverneur Morris, they create the preamble to the Constitution. And that's September the 10th. And they come up pretty much with everything that we now know of as the Constitution of the United States. Some objections, some minor objections between September the 10th and 17th when they sign. But during that week, it is Washington speaking for the first time, saying, what if we changed representation from 1 to 40,000 to 1 to 30,000? The hope was he could influence Randolph from Virginia, also from Virginia, who introduced the darn Randolph plan or Virginia plan in the beginning. And in the end, now he doesn't want to sign. So Washington suggests, what if I change it? Would that move you? And Randolph remained stubborn. So that was one thing, but it got changed to 1 to 30,000. Today, in practice, it's 1 for 600,000. And then they sign, and then at the end, they're all coming up to sign, and Ben Franklin, which is the quote I've used for the website, which you've kindly informed people of, is that I looked at the chair of that Washington sat in and asked the question, I've been sitting here wondering, do we have a rising sun on that chair or a setting sun on that chair? And he says, I think now we have a rising sun. For many, many days, I thought we had a setting sun. And so the message that Franklin ends with is a message of hope, that through 88 days of deliberation, we have come up with what we've now called the Constitution, including the preamble, 7 articles, but it took a long 88 days of slogging and compromising and people leaving in a huff. You can't do very much if you leave in a huff. And Hamilton's return, and that final committee is very high toned, and that's where the preamble comes from.
Well, that was an amazing walkthrough of the Constitutional Convention. I don't think I've ever heard it summarized in that succinct, but yet very elaborate way. And with the acts 1 through 4, that's a great way to look.
Oh, sure. I'll ask a few. I actually wrote notes because there was so much.
Janine's notes will go with Madison's notes.
Yeah, there you go. I certainly concur with what Kathy just said. That was pretty brilliant. That was chock full of information. I'll just make a few notes and then I'll ask my specific question. Interesting, that they thought that the national power was weak compared to the states, and how the juxtaposition of today where the now the national power is too big and the states don't have any power. And it's been really interesting to see sort of the autocorrect of that starting to happen a little bit, which is interesting because I think when that happens, it also gives people that are maybe younger or don't really understand our country and what a republic really means, or what a federal government really means, is that, oh wait, the states are supposed to have power. That's probably something that was so obvious centuries, centuries ago, but today everyone just thinks we're a national government. What do you mean federal power? What do you mean states have power? So I thought that juxtaposition is just an interesting to compare it to today. I also like the Committee of Five and how they felt that the people liked smaller constituencies, and that's how it should be divided within the Constitution, but also how they had to do the same thing within the actual deliberations, their own deliberations. They had to kind of create small constituencies with these committees of five. I love all this breakdown of the compromises that Sherman, the Connecticut Compromise, and who would do what. I think, gosh, I'm trying to think of my specific question. I think what stood out to me as far as my one question, and I'm going to toss it so everybody has time, is in regard to taxes, because they were two things that they wanted to be able to have that you mentioned earlier at the beginning in Act One, which was they wanted interstate to work on interstate commerce and the ability to tax. And I think that's a fascinating, just touch on that a little bit, Professor Gordon Lloyd, about what taxes meant to them and how did they tax back then? Because obviously it was not a tax on income. So they taxed whiskey and things like that. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? What their thoughts were when they thought tax in the day?
Yeah. Well, under the Articles, the federal, the whatever we call it, the federal government, see, it really wasn't a government. It was a federation of states. It was like NATO or European Union or United Nations in that sense, a League of Nations. It was a League of Nations. It was 13 nations getting together for limited purposes. And limited purposes meant you had to justify that it was really in the general welfare, what you're going to do, or really in the common defense that you were going to do. And you didn't have taxing power to do it. So you had to ask the states themselves, you have to put in a requisition. It's like you asking for a reimbursement for travel. You have to detail what it is you want. You have to show that the travel was necessary and that you document it. And then it is up to whoever is funding your trip or whatever to say yay, nay, or could you come back with more evidence? So that there was no independent way. So the basic form of taxation was calling home, please send money. And that would then it left it up to each of the 13 state legislatures to decide. And how they did the taxing, they did their own form of taxation through commerce, through tariffs. And that's how money was essentially raised. And you're quite correct. The 16th Amendment, people would, when the time the 16th Amendment came, people were arguing, well, is the power to have an income tax that's specifically written into the Constitution? The answer is no, it's not. And then the other side would say, well, is it specifically prohibited by the Constitution? The answer is no. So what do you do in a case of that we don't know? How do you interpret silence? And we still, back in those days, in the early 19th century, said, let's pass an amendment to the Constitution which specifically grants it. And you can't get much closer to the deliberate sense of the community than 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the people of the state legislatures passing it. That comes as close to unanimity as possible to still run a government. So in the beginning, under the
I don't think they knew what they I don't think they knew what they were voting for if they'd only known. But
I mean, the
can you
16th
just tell us
Amendment?
what? Yeah, when they were voting for that, if everybody knew how intense taxes would become.
We could
But
always
what
overturn it. We overturned, you and I, this is how
True.
you and I began our conversations years ago with the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments. This is, we overturned.
That's so true. You're so true. But my one question for you before we move on is, but they did need the tax. They did need to raise money in 1787. It was one of the things they needed to be able to do.
Yep.
So what were their ideas for a tax then before the 16th Amendment? It was taxing products,
goods, trade, import duties, things like that. So you're you're really taxing like sales taxes, basically, if we put it into today's language, not income tax, sales tax. And who had the power over sales tax? The states. And so you send in a requisition, please send money. We estimate we need $1 billion. And we, the Congress, suggest that you, Virginia, pay 300 million out of that 1 billion. Not up to us. We don't care how you raise it, but we would like from you. And of course, Virginia might send 50 million and say, do without. And that causes great trouble if you want to have a sort of a more vibrant central government. So I think
But that was before the Constitution.
No one really
what happened after the Constitution?
What
that was before the Constitution, where they could. Yeah, well, after the Constitution was passed, how did they tax?
Again, through the same thing, through
still tariffs.
Yeah, tariffs, etc. What I mean, if we break it down to sales tax, income tax, wealth tax, I mean, they're still doing sales tax.
Nothing really changed. The Constitution didn't really change anything in regard to taxes for them then, as far as raising money.
No, but what it did, yes, it did, because it left it open. No longer, because Congress under the Constitution and Article 1, Section 8 has the power to tax and to go into debt. That's another way of raising money, by going into debt. And so under the Articles, Congress did not have the power to tax at all. Never mind income tax, never mind sales tax. They didn't have the power to tax. They had to ask the states, please send money. Under the Constitution, what changed is that Congress had the power to tax and to pass bills of credit, which means go into debt.
Under what clause? Where is that?
Article 1, Section 8, right at the beginning.
Okay. Okay, very cool. All right, thank you. I'm going to toss it because because I could hog all the time. So I'm tossing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Janine. I think it's so refreshing to hear your voice on these chats again. I know we've missed you. But I have lots of questions. I'd like to echo, Janine and Kathy, Professor Lloyd. I think that was a brilliant overview. But my first question is, over the course of this debate, how much public awareness or input was there of this? Was it all sort of closed door meetings that the public didn't know about, or was it being reported on and debated publicly throughout the process?
No, there was no public debate. There was no opens the screen, the curtains were closed, and there was a secrecy rule that was signed. And for the most part, I would say 98%, the secrecy rule was followed. Now, that secrecy rule did not apply to an exchange of correspondence between Washington, who presided, and Hamilton, who left in a sort of a huff and sort of said, when you folks have stopped playing in the sandbox and really get serious, give me a call. So Hamilton, Washington would relate what was going on and begging Hamilton to come back. So that there's a sense in which Hamilton, did that violate the secrecy rule? No, because Hamilton was still a delegate, although he wasn't there. There's another, Madison kept Jefferson informed, and Jefferson was in France as the ambassador. And so there's an exchange of correspondence which indicates, in sort of very delicate language, but Jefferson and Madison knew each other from the 1770s. I mean, they could read, they understood what the inflections of a comma or whatever, they could pick that up. Why secrecy? Jefferson, responding to Madison, said, I didn't like the idea of secrecy. It creates a bad image. And by the way, historians in America who suspect that something naughty was going on at the founding take that secrecy rule as evidence of some kind of conspiracy taking place by a few folks over the many unsuspecting. And so the secrecy rule was not defended by Jefferson. It was not it is used by progressive historians in the 20th century to belittle or downgrade what went on. Madison made a great defense of the secrecy rule. He says, this is not a show. There's plenty of time for show. When we ratified, and boy, was there a show. All the newspapers, debates, Publius, Brutus, all those debates, which we've talked about, those were in public, published in newspapers. Reporters showed up at the ratification debate, and they were reported in the newspapers. Madison's point is there's going to be plenty of time for us to debate up and down the country in newspapers, everything that we talked about. But this is the time for proper discussion. It's like a jury. That would be the analogy, a jury, where the jury is sequestered and they listen to each other and they persuade each other in a deliberation. And then after the jury, head of the jury, what do you say? Guilty, and here's our reason. Fine. And then after, they're interviewed for how did they make their decision? Same thing. So secrecy, says Madison, encourages honest conversation instead of playing to the crowds. It'll be plenty of time to play to the crowds, which they did.
And I'm curious, I know you don't have a time machine, but how do you think the results of the Constitutional Convention may have been different had the public known? And if so, like what ways do you think the public may have influenced the delegates?
Well, I think they would have influenced the delegates by sending them instructions. And some of those instructions were in place already. But if they were reported that the delegates wouldn't have been able to meet at the city tavern and have talks after dinner. People probably were there at the tavern and they heard these folks talk. There's something, I mean, how about having an executive session? If you're up for tenure or employment at a certain agency, and as a 5-person committee that's going to decide, that one of the first things that has to be decided upon, is this going to be a public forum or is this someplace it's going to be a private forum? And then we'll let you know our opinion after we talk. So how do I think it would have been different? I think it would have been different because the people who were already receiving instructions would have received even greater push and shove from various agencies to get the job done. I mean, it's difficult enough to travel from Georgia to Philadelphia. Can you imagine Georgia newspapers being in Philadelphia to get all that done? And then by the time they get back, it's already 60 days. Did she leave?
Sorry, I think my Wi-Fi went out for a second. Thank you so much. And then I was wondering, how were the delegates to the Constitutional Convention selected? And did the process differ in any states?
They were selected by the state legislatures. And there were 2 different, shall we say, modes. One I would call the Annapolis Mode. The Annapolis Mode was in Annapolis, Maryland. It was motivated mainly by Virginia to get things done. Why do we have to wait for Congress to tell us that we can have a convention to talk about Congress? The spirit of 1776 says if Americans are don't like something going on, we'll have an association, we'll have a meeting. So they had a meeting. Not everybody attended this meeting in Annapolis, but there was a decision at that time in Annapolis to say there will be a meeting in May 1787 to discuss the current Articles of Confederation in order to make them more appropriate for contemporary times. And 6 states followed that model, which was really, that we call it the Annapolis model, but Virginia was behind it. So that's the attempt of Virginians there was to thoroughly reconsider the Articles, and that's often been called by historians, that's a coup. It was illegal because they didn't have any authority. And Madison's response is, we have the authority of 1776. When do Americans have to wait for permission from some higher ups to meet to consider their general well-being. So you got those 6. Then the other 6 cut out Rhode Island. Rhode Island wasn't interested in this process at all. Leave us alone. The other 6 said that we have to wait for approval from Congress to meet in Philadelphia. And Congress finally gave its approval, but the approval was to meet and consider what amendments you think are necessary, and then we will decide. So you've got a 6-6 split as to the instructions which they get, but all of the delegates were actually elected by their own state legislature, which in turn was
Well,
elected by the people.
Great. Oh, thank you so much for that. This has been illuminating, and I will now gladly pass on my questions.
Bye. Thank you again, and good luck in Morocco.
Hello, Professor.
Oh, you
James Madison.
Oh, yeah. How are you doing, Jimmy?
We're both here tonight. We're both here. The James Madison had this concept about factions, which is the faction debates with Sherman and others. There's a tension between Madison's idea and their idea of the liberty within the states.
Yes.
And the state and the federal government. So there's a couple questions within this. Number one, Madison by no means was, if looking at him through today's lens, he by no means was for a very dominating, powerful central government over the states. Yes or no? And then also the idea of factions as well. Can you say how that is how Madison's idea is articulated in the Constitution, and where? I know that there's many places, but if you want to highlight anywhere you think we should look to.
Well, I think the Virginia plan shows the extent to which Madison is willing to go to extend the powers of this general government, or the continental government, and he went beyond giving the power of taxation and the power of interstate commerce. He went beyond that. He would have liked to have given Congress the power to veto any state law that violated the fundamental principles. So in the beginning, Madison was willing to go as far as was possible to create some kind of government at the general level, rather than simply a federation, which depended completely on the states for its financing and for its livelihood. Now, when we have earlier in the year and last year got to the Brutus Publius debates, and Brutus's point is, and so is Publius, there are 2 tendencies with, if you make a compromise between the nation and the states, how is that compromise going to be maintained through life? And the answer, with great difficulty. Brutus is going to point that there's a tendency within that compromise for it to concentrate in the general government, and so the state governments are going to lose their clout. And Madison's response is, yes, there is a tendency for this compromise to become unglued, but the tendency is not to centralization; it is to decentralization. So that what we have to look out for is the states sort of peeling off and deciding when they're going to leave the union, when they're going to decide to defy the federal law, which is why we have the supremacy clause in Article 6, that when push comes to shove, the law of the federal government is the one that's going to prevail. So there's these 2 tendencies. And through time, one tendency is going to exist over another. And particularly when you have war, you're going to have a tendency to encourage the federal government to expand its powers, because that's one of the reasons why it's there. And then does it, after war is over, do the powers go back as they used to be? So it's I think Madison's point is we're in such a state in 1787 that any strengthening of the general government is going to do us well. Here we are in 1787. We declared independence in 1776. Here we are still messing around 11 years later with some kind of continental arrangement. It's time to get serious, because otherwise we're going to fall apart and the revolution is going to be for nothing. And so I think that's one answer to your question. Maintaining the balance is going to be difficult and it requires statesmanship. Madison's thought is that the powers that are granted to the general government are few and defined. Therefore, the real danger is from the state governments who are going to nibble and nibble and nibble away at even those that are few and defined. And Brutus would say the tendency is for concentration. So those few powers will become many, and they'll become ill-defined, and they'll have all kinds of things where the judiciary will be unstoppable. And Madison's answer is, no, they're tied down by precedent. They won't do those kinds of things. Brutus, you're imagining. That was a conversation we had before. Faction, for Madison, the primary cause of faction, the most common and durable source of faction is arguments over property. It's creation and its distribution. And his point is that that won't go away. Faction is sown in the nature of man. But the smaller community, says Madison, the easier it is for us to discover how nasty another person can be. And his point, it comes out in this phrase: if every Athenian were a Socrates, it would still be a mob. Now, there's something he says about, if I were to talk to you one-on-one, I could persuade you. I could encourage you to control yourself. When you get into a crowd, 10, 15, 20, whatever, and then with pitchforks or whatever it is, right? Yeah, how am I going to persuade you? So Madison's point is, if people, it's in our nature to quarrel. The most we can do is to control it, because if you get rid of it, you give everybody the same opinions, passions, and interests, you got rid of liberty. And the whole point to this is to preserve liberty, which means we have to tolerate faction. How far can we tolerate faction? How far can we extend the republic? So that Sherman's response is, people are happier in small republics, where they know each other, they care about each other. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. How, George? How's your son? How's your daughter? What's your dog doing today? And Madison would say, you know what the problem with that is? Hi, George. Hi, son. How's your dog doing today? They can't mind their own business because they're all on top of each other. Spread it out.
So we know that Hamilton was very outspoken. And I often think, he left the convention. So what do you think was the most important decision made while he wasn't there that might not have been gotten to without his absence?
That is a really good question. All the questions are good, but you see, that is very good. One of the things I decided to do very early on in this business was keep an attendance record to the best of my ability, and then link it up with issues, so that on the website we have an attendance record, a day-by-day, 88-day attendance record of all the delegates, and then you sort of line that up with what issues are coming down. One of the contemporary issues is the war powers, and Hamilton is usually associated with the war powers of the presidency, and he would enhance the war powers. So people have asked me, so what did Hamilton say when the war powers came out? Because originally in the draft from the committee in detail, the draft was that Congress shall have the power to make war. And through the discussions, it was changed that Congress shall have the power to declare war. Republics don't make war. Republics only defend themselves from outside invasion. So if you use the word make, that sounds too much like a monarchy. So let's make it declare. So people have asked me, well, so what was Hamilton's position on that? I mean, if there's any issue that would somehow define our understanding of Hamilton, one of them certainly would be war powers of the presidency. And the answer is Hamilton wasn't there. And I think he would have been more, well, of course he would have been more vociferous. Had he been, Hamilton never known, did he ever shut up? For all the times he wasn't there, he sure added up a heck of a lot of statements in Madison's coverage. So that's one area. I think another area would have been interesting, and here's why. Hamilton left on just after June the 18th. He made his speech. That's a long day speech. You've got Virginia proposal, you got Sherman, you got New Jersey plan, and Hamilton says, you're all playing in the sandbox. This is what we really want. We want the president and the Congress to elect the governors of the states. You want to talk about a centralized government. I mean, that comes out of the Hamilton plan on the 18th. And no one's going there. So Hamilton didn't make a difference on that day, and he was present all the way to the end of June, and then he decides to leave, all right? And he says, in effect, when you guys stop doing all of this nonsense about states and people and this and that, get really down to serious business about powers and such, let me know. So Washington keeps in touch with him. But what happens is right at as we get into beginning of July, okay, there are 3 delegates from New York. This is where attendance record and who there matters. There are 3 delegates from New York. A guy called Yates, another guy called Lansing, and then Hamilton. Lansing and Yates was sent to outvote Hamilton. Hamilton left. Yates and Lansing said, job is done, Hamilton's left. We leave. So that leaves New York without a vote. So even if Hamilton had been there all the time, he couldn't vote because New York required a quorum of 2 before New York could cast a vote. So Hamilton could influence had he been there, but in the pubs, in the taverns, in the talking, there's such a, you could still talk. You couldn't vote on behalf of New York. So what is really interesting is when he returns, he gets selected to be on this committee on style, although technically he's not representing New York because New York can't be represented because the other 2 have left. And then at the end, if you look at the Constitution and its signing, Hamilton signs on behalf of New York, which is a bit of a twist because New York can't vote. I hope I've answered your question without exhausting the whole thing. That's good. I mean, what if? I mean, what if Jefferson had been there? I mean, what if Adams had been there? You know, and on your point as well, let me ask a more direct question. What if Hamilton had been there during a certain period of time? Because we knew he was there at the beginning and we knew he was there at the end. But he wasn't there for the committee in detail.
Well, that was a great question and a wonderful answer. And Professor Lloyd, we had promised you that we would let you off in time for your next engagement because we know that you're so busy today promoting your new website, which again, Aubrey, you might want to pull it up, americanfounding.org. And it's just very exciting. I know you've worked so hard on it. I don't know if we have time for one just really super quick question from the audience. Linda had asked about George Washington's leadership style and what it meant that he only spoke twice. What was he trying to achieve by speaking so little?
Others spoke so much he didn't need to. Washington, I think, retained his influence through his status. All the paintings of the Constitutional Convention. If there's one delegate who stands out that you can always recognize, it's Washington. He's almost like he's standing up. He's the tallest. He's the such and such. And so I think Washington's stature didn't have to come through the words that he uttered, but through the fact that he was there. And he was there from, I mean, he was in 1776, 1775, 1776, he was a delegate from Virginia talking about whether to have reconciliation or to have independence. And then he was selected to be the general. So I mean, he always had this status when the general was in town. I mean, there were lines of people, according to what I've read, lines of people waiting to see him. So his status, his stature didn't come from how often he spoke or what he spoke, but by the fact of his presence. And in fact, there's a couple of stories quickly. One is that Washington was, because of the secrecy rule, etc., he was very upset because he discovered you could always put down notes that they right. That's somehow how we have a lot of the interpretations of what went on. Put down notes, and apparently one day Washington says there were notes that were left behind. I hope that the person who left them behind will have the sense to come and pick them up. He didn't have to say that on the floor, but it wasn't necessarily recorded, but he said them. And one of the delegates rushed home to where he was staying at the Indian Queen Tavern. And he says, I just sighed with great relief that I found them at home and they weren't there. So there's another one, a bet between Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris, that Hamilton goes up to Morris and says, I bet you won't go up to the general and say, you look mighty fine today. I mean, I'm using my own, mighty fine today, General. And I bet you a dinner for 12. And Morris actually went up to Washington and put his hand on Washington's shoulder and said, you look mighty fine today. And according to legend, Washington just stood there saying nothing, took his own hand, put it on Morris's hand, and took it off. And Morris then said, I paid a very high price for winning a bet. So watching stature.
Well, thank you. And
I would also say, I just want to throw out that it was that letter that Washington sent to the ratify the Constitution where all his power was. That's where he, right? Would you concur with that?
That's right. That's right. And he had this ability to consult with Hamilton, consult with Madison, and he continued that with the controversy over the first bank. He asked Madison's opinion, he asked Hamilton's opinion, and in the end, I think he was the one who was responsible for what went up. And yes, you're absolutely correct. His influence at the end with that letter is important. That's a very important addition, Janine.
Well, Professor Lloyd, we know you've got to get on to the next event, and we thank you so much for your time, and we'll let you go.
Yes,
and we just want to say to our audience that if you enjoyed today, please sign up for our book club and read more of Professor Lloyd's book, and he'll be back with us for that. You can sign up on the link on the Q&A. And we want to invite everybody back next week. We're going to be talking about Article 1 of the Constitution as we walk through the Constitution for the next few weeks before Constitution Day. So anybody else want to say anything before we jump off?
It's always good to see familiar faces and inquisitive people and deal with inquisitive people. You folks are doing a great job constituting America. Well done.
Oh, thank you. We're just so honored to have you with us. You do a beautiful job as always. Thank you. Thank y'all.
The blessings of liberty upon you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor Gordon Lloyd. Thank you, everybody.